Hey folks, this is Rhykker with an analysis video on the new Moonbase map Teasers, as well as some other Overwatch news from the past week. This is a deep analysis video where we separate fact from speculation, and we even bust out some high school science, so buckle up. Yesterday evening, Blizzard released a new lore teaser about the Moonbase that Winston grew up on, in the form of a blog post with images on the Overwatch website. The blog post, which was published under Atlas News, which is a fictional news outlet that has brought us many Overwatch lore updates in the past, shed some light into what happened years ago on the Horizon Lunar Colony. Now, we already knew that Winston was a genetically enhanced gorilla raised on a moonbase, one among many such gorillas on the base. But Winston was special, more intelligent, and his handler, Dr. Harold Winston, taught him science and basically served as a father to him. We already knew that one day the gorillas led a successful uprising against their handlers. They killed all the humans on the moonbase, and they claimed the base as their own. Winston, not a part of this uprising, built a rocket and escaped to Earth. And this is all we knew about the moonbase until now. With this latest information, we know that the colony's databases and monitoring systems are still operational all these years later. There hasn't been direct contact with the Lunar Colony, but emails between staff members from the past have been retrieved, shedding some light into the days and even moments before the uprising. The first email is from Nevsky, sent to Winston. Winston, the human scientist, not the gorilla scientist. Although, I guess he is a gorilla scientist, given he's a scientist who studies gorillas. Anyway, in the email, Nevsky mentions confining some of the usual troublemaker gorillas to their rooms because their behavior is starting to get out of control, and they may even have caused harm. He suggests that all the gorillas should be confined to quarters so as to not make it seem like they're playing favorites. He's obviously referencing Winston here, the gorilla scientist, not the gorilla scientist. The next email is from Flores, and no, this likely has nothing to do with the Flores from the Sombra emails. Flores is just like the Spanish equivalent of Smith. The email is addressed to everyone and mentions strange sounds coming from the vents throughout the colony. A hint to us, the reader, that something may be up there crawling around. The next email is from Winston to Yoshida, and is a reply to the email chain started by Nevsky about confining gorillas to their quarters. Winston agrees that the gorillas should be confined, remarks that the gorillas have had an unexpectedly negative reaction to the genetic therapy, while hinting that Winston Jr. is an exception, and he suggests putting a stop to the gene treatments. The next email is from Zhang to everyone, titled, "Have you seen me?" It's possibly the most intriguing email of the bunch, so I'll read it verbatim. By the way, is anyone else concerned that it's been almost a week and no one's seen Hammond? His cage has been empty for a week. I guess it's not a big deal to anyone else, but it would be good to have all our test specimens accounted for. I don't know why we ever thought it was a good idea to have smaller test subjects. I completely regret it. So let's dissect this. He titles the email, "Have you seen me?" And he talks about a missing test subject named Hammond. He seems to think that the others wouldn't consider it as big a deal as he does, so Hammond is likely Zhang's test subject, in the same way that Winston is Winston's test subject. As for that subject line, let's say it was Gorilla Winston that went missing. If human Winston would send an email titled, "Have you seen me?" then it would clearly be a playful way of saying, "Have you seen Winston?" This likely seems to be what Zhang was going for, but it's a little odd that the subject is named Hammond. Hammond is typically a last name, and Zhang is typically a last name. So the theory gets a little muddled because of that. But what we also learn here is that Hammond is a smaller test subject, and that unlike the gorillas confined to their quarters or rooms, he was in a cage. And it's unlikely that Hammond is an infant gorilla, because he's been missing for a week. I would hope that the scientists wouldn't be so irresponsible as to leave a baby animal unsupervised for a full week. Though, honestly, any test subject missing for a week doesn't exactly lead to a 5-star Yelp review. Nevertheless, this likely suggests that Hammond is a different species from the gorillas. He may be something like a chimpanzee, but he could also be anything else. And likely anything else that's small enough to crawl through a vent. Now at this point, I need to bring up the jetpack cat theories. Basically, the devs said that they once had an idea for a character that was a cat that flew around with a jetpack, thus Jetpack Cat, and the community absolutely loved this idea. And now everyone is saying, jokingly or not, that Hammond is Jetpack Cat. To be fair, a cat does fit in vents, would be put into a cage during a lockdown, and is more likely than other animals to be left unsupervised for a week. Especially relative to a more dangerous animal like a monkey or an ape. But, I mean, come on. That takes us to our final email from Winston to everyone, marked high priority with the subject Station Emergency. It reads, I need help at airlock E35 immediately. Emergency malfunction with the airlock. Need everyone to come at once. Situation is critical. This is not a drill. At first blush, this just seems to be the emergency caused by the gorilla uprising. But on closer inspection, there seems to be something much more insidious at play here. First off, in the event of an emergency, you'd think sending out an email may not be the best way to reach people. Are we to believe that there was no way to relay a message more urgently? Like a voice or video message? This is a future in which we have the technology to build and maintain a base on the moon, but Skype video calling is just too much for their computers to handle? I don't know about you guys, but if I'm passing by an airlock that's malfunctioning, sucking our oxygen out into space, I'm not going to take the time to carefully type out a subject line and send emails to a mailing list. But that's just opinion. Secondly, why do you need everyone? Is everyone equally suited to repairing an airlock? Is there no one on this base who is, I don't know, capable of repairing things? You've got a team of scientists, but no one on the base that can actually fix shit that breaks down? If anything, calling everyone is just a waste of time, since not everyone's gonna arrive at the same time, and you'll just have to keep re-explaining the situation every time a new person filters in. Maybe I'm just overanalyzing, but this almost seems like a setup. Like someone is sending that message from Winston's account to lure all the scientists into one place at the same time. A trap. What if Hammond, or someone else, killed Dr. Winston, targeting him because he was jealous of Gorilla Winston, and then using his email to lure all the other scientists into the airlock before either blowing them out into space or just suffocating them? Just a theory. Then we have one final image on the blog, an image of the colony's monitoring systems. This is current, this is right now. As you can see, we're still tracking 7 specimens, but 2 are missing. Winston, who is now back on Earth with Overwatch, and Hammond. Does this suggest that Hammond has also somehow made it back to Earth? Also noteworthy in this image is the fact that Section E on the base is highlighted in red. The observatory, we know that this is where the airlock emergency happened, since Winston called it airlock E35. I'll just very quickly mention theories that the labeled sections could refer to control points on a map. This would be something unlike anything we have. We've only had A, B control points so far. It's more likely this was just for handy labeling of the station, but yes, it is a fine theory that this could be referring to control points in a new type of game mode. Also noteworthy on this image is the technobabble in the top right. Antenna gain, frequency, wavelength. While it may at first seem that this is a radio frequency that we can tune into and listen to the sweet, sweet sounds of the Space Gorillas and their new hit single, Feels Bad Man Inc., those frequencies are actually used for radio navigation, radar. And in fact, upon doing some research, I found a device that exists in the real world that uses almost the exact specifications listed here. The Eldora, the Electra Doppler radar, or Eldora for short, was an airborne weather research radar. Mounted on an airplane, Eldora would observe Earth's atmosphere. And if you look at its technical specifications, you'll see that its antenna gain is 38.7 decibels, with a transmit frequency of 9.3 to 9.8 gigahertz, exactly what we're seeing in Overwatch's image. Eldora's wavelength, however, is 3.2 centimeters. And this is where it differs from Overwatch's 33.2 centimeters. It's off by about a factor of 10. However, it seems that Overwatch's team may have made an error here. Warning! Science ahead! You see, wavelength and frequency are inherently tied together. If you know one of these 2 variables, you can calculate the other. Picture a wave. No, not a surfing wave, a high school science class wave. The distance between two crests in the wave is called the wavelength. The frequency is just a measure of how many crests pass a certain point per second. 1 hertz just refers to 1 cycle per second. So 1 crest will be passing per second. 1 billion hertz is a gigahertz. So a frequency of 9.3 gigahertz means 9.3 billion crests are passing by every second. Now, radio waves and light waves and microwaves and gamma waves, everything here is all basically the same thing. It's all just radiation. What makes them different is their wavelength or frequency. When we talk about radiation, there's a range of these waves that are visible to the naked eye, and we call these the visible light waves that fall into the color spectrum. We start with the shortest wavelengths, which are violet, and if you go even shorter than that, you get into ultraviolet, invisible to the eye. But if you go larger from violet, you progress through the color spectrum until you arrive at red, the longest wavelength of visible light. At even longer wavelengths, we get into infrared, which we can no longer see. And then we get into microwaves. And once we get to wavelengths of about 1 centimeter to 1 meter, and to you Yankee Doodles, that's about half an inch to about 3 feet, then we've arrived at radio waves. FM radio waves only start at about 1 meter, and AM radio waves are at about 100 meters. But before that, we have radar and TV waves. So again, frequency and wavelength are directly related. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the frequency. And that's because all radiation is traveling at the same speed, the speed of light. So a longer wavelength means that fewer crests will pass every second than a shorter wavelength. Observe these two waves traveling at the same speed. As you can see, the one with the shorter wavelength has more crests pass a certain point per second, thus it has a higher frequency. So this means that we can calculate exactly what the wavelength would be for any given frequency and vice versa. So the wavelength for a radio wave with a frequency of 9.3 gigahertz would turn out to be 3.2 centimeters. Or if we use the 9.8 gigahertz figure, we get 3.1 centimeters. This calculation is perfectly in line with the technical specifications of the Eldora radar. But that means that Overwatch's radar is off by a factor of 10. The only way to make the math work with Overwatch's numbers, assuming that the wavelength and frequency figures are correct, is to change the third variable, the speed. We just assume that these waves were traveling at the speed of light, but sometimes they could be traveling at different speeds. Unfortunately, the way the math would work out, we would need these waves, in Overwatch's world here, to be traveling at 10 times the speed of light in order for the wavelength and frequency to match. And that's just impossible since nothing could travel faster than light. So all this to say, these numbers don't make sense. The team either meant to copy the specifications from Eldora and made a typo in the wavelength, or they were just making up poppycock technobabble and based themselves on real figures but wanted to make some creative changes, not realizing that they completely broke the science, or there is a hidden clue in here somewhere. Clearly, Doomfist will release on February 33rd. Now, that covers the blog post teaser. But we've actually had other, more subtle teasers. On Lijiang Tower, you can see a number of teasers, some added recently, all supporting this narrative that we may one day get a moon base map. On Lijiang Tower in the spawn shuttle, we can see a poster for the Horizon moon base. A poster that could also be found in various areas within Lijiang Control. In the image, we see the Horizon base, a rover, and a pod that is either landing or taking off. We can find ads for the company Lujiang Interstellar, which oversees the moon base. Although my translation app tells me that this says Star Trek, this is definitely meant to be Lujiang Interstellar. In this one, we see the moon being orbited by a space station of some kind. This one here says Advanced Aerospace Technology and seems to depict a rover on the moon. Possibly that same rover in the other ad slash poster, just maybe expanded. Here we see a closer look at the station, and on the Lijiang control map we can see a model of the rover itself, as well as a computer showing what appears to be the orbital trajectory of the station, following a figure 8 between Earth and the moon. I'm no astrophysicist, but it seems that's an orbit that would require a lot of energy to maintain, since you're essentially constantly performing slingshot maneuvers from one body to the other on a tight angle. Also on the desk we can find this picture of Winston and Winston. But then the biggest teaser of all, around the control point, the monitors now show the moon base. In the past, they showed a map of the Earth. Why change this unless to tease something? Floating above the control point appears to be a 3D vector model of the space station, with some malfunctions highlighted with exclamation marks. And we know from some Chinese text on an electronic ticker near the lion statues on one of the other Lijiang maps that, in breaking news, the Interstellar Journey space station suffered sudden emergency failure. So basically things haven't been going great for Lijiang. Now we've had another teaser of sorts that's been in the game files for a very long time. A Winston voice line where he mentions the moon.
To go back to the moon? I don't know.
This was data mined from the game files almost a year ago and has fueled since then theories that we might one day get a moon map. It could just be something that the team scrapped, or it could be that the idea for a moon map was in the works for a very long time. Now I'd like to cover some tangentially related things pertaining to words that Jeff Kaplan has spoken. So when the anniversary event launched, game director Jeff Kaplan gave a developer update video in which he said that the new maps and modes were just the tip of the iceberg of what's coming. Have a listen.
And we highly recommend you start playing around with these new maps and mode in custom game. So that's just the tip of the iceberg, some of the fun stuff that's coming as part of the anniversary event.
This could mean that there's even more new stuff coming, but it could also mean that he just wasn't able to cover everything in this video that already came with this event, such as all the new cosmetics. Some people have been using this to suggest that we're definitely getting new stuff soon, but take it with a grain of salt. Expect nothing, but hope for Doomfist. Something else that Jeff said recently that has been interpreted as a hint, and has actually often been misquoted as "there's a new hero on the horizon," was actually, the direct quote was, "there's some really cool hero news just on the horizon." Have a listen.
But I think the players getting their hands on some new core mode maps that will be added to quick play and competitive play will be great. There's also some really cool hero news just on the horizon.
Again, people have been misquoting this as "there's a new hero on the horizon," which definitely seems like a much more direct hint to the moon base, the Horizon Lunar Colony, and that we're either going to get a hero release alongside this map, or that on the map we'll see hints at the new hero. But when we look at the exact phrasing Jeff used, it changes things somewhat. The exact words that Jeff used, "just on the horizon," make a little less sense as a hint than saying "on the horizon." And this quote comes as a much larger spiel rather than a specific prepared response to a question. It seems to me that Jeff didn't really intend to drop a hint. He wasn't necessarily being super careful with his words here. He was just giving a long answer and used a colloquial expression. That said, our Jeff is a tricksy one, so who knows if this was in fact a hint. Now before closing this video, I just wanted to touch on a couple other recent news stories. First, some data miners have found evidence for a new upcoming event in the game files. Allegedly. This story caused a lot of hype, speculation, and confusion. So the programmer of the application that data miners have been using, IQ19, spoke up to clarify certain things. Basically, what happened was that data miners found mention of loot boxes being attributed to an Event 7. And since the other events are pretty clearly labeled with respect to loot boxes, they thought this was a new event. Well, it turns out that the program just defaulted to labeling the loot box Event 7 loot box, because the program was, well, programmed to refer to new loot boxes as Event blank, since all the new loot boxes up to now have been tied to an event. In other words, there's nothing in the actual game files referring to an Event 7 or an event at all. This was just the programmer's naming convention, the programmer of the data mining file, not a Blizzard programmer. In order to help clear up confusion, the programmer has now changed the name of the loot box in his program. Something that actually was data mined for real was the model of the loot box. It looks like this. It is a sexy golden loot box, and so the programmer changed the name from Event 7 to Golden. Basically what this means is that there is a new golden loot box, but it is not confirmed whether it is tied to a specific event, be it a new event or the Summer Games. Jeff, in a Reddit interview, suggested that we likely won't be getting any new events in Overwatch's second year, but that we'll instead revisit our previous events. So some people were speculating that Event 7 was simply referring to the 2017 Summer Games event. Again though, there's no evidence suggesting either way. The data miners went on to point to strings in the code that mentioned common loot boxes, and theorized that we may soon get tiers of loot boxes, like common, rare, etc. The programmer clarified that the program simply calls a loot box that is not attributed to an event a common loot box, and that is not Blizzard's naming scheme. So now that the smoke is cleared, what are we left with that's known for sure? Well, there's a new golden loot box in the game files, and that's all we know. Everything else is speculation. The last thing I want to mention before closing off this video is that the Overwatch team squashed some rumors that they have been working away at a single-player campaign expansion. When asked via Twitter if, quote, do you guys ever plan to have a one-player campaign for this game, they replied, we don't have any plans for that right now. While this doesn't rule out the possibility of a campaign in the future, it does confirm that there currently isn't any in the works. It also technically doesn't rule out a multiplayer campaign, but it would be pretty dickish of the team to use a semantic argument as an excuse for misleading us. And that wraps up this video. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Are you excited by what's to come in Overwatch? Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more Overwatch analysis.